Welcome to our Sound for Video session. It is the 16th of December, 2015, and we're getting started here. We didn't have a lot of questions that came in this week. However, there are some other things I'd like to cover that we'll take care of first, and then if you do join up and you do have questions, we'd love to hear those as well. So it's noon my time, Mountain Standard Time here in the Rocky Mountains. We'll go for 30 minutes today. First thing I wanted to talk about, first of all, if you were wondering about or in the market for sound recorders, audio recorders, Tascam has a new one that I just finished a review of last night that you may find helpful. You can find that over on the YouTube channel, just if you're not familiar with where that is, Curtis Judd over on YouTube, and you'll see it's the Tascam DR701. And let me just tell you a few things about that, kind of the summary. It's actually a recorder that I borrowed from B&H. They loaned it to me, which was very kind of them, so I appreciate that. What can I tell you about it? Well, a few things. First of all, it's a 4-input, so it has 4 XLR combo inputs. That means you can also input TRS, 1/4-inch cables into that, and you can choose whether each of those inputs will be line level, and then there are, I believe, 4 different gain stages, main gain stages. So there's low, mid, high, and high plus, just like on the previous Tascam recorders, the DR60D Mark II and the DR70D. The difference in this case, though, is that when we actually check the measure the noise performance, and again, this is at a very practical level. This is not super scientific. Just taking it into my basement studio there, hooking up a condenser mic, in this case, the Audio-Technica 4053B. And we were able to get very good noise performance on those. In fact, better than the DR60D Mark II, which from my previous experience was pretty much identical to the DR70D. So by better, I mean somewhere in the realm of about 5 dB quieter, which was pretty impressive. But again, that's practical from the standpoint that that's picking everything up that the recorder is doing. It's picking up everything that the microphone, any noise that the microphone is generating, the cable, and any noise that's actually in the room. So it's all of those things put together. But nevertheless, at a practical level, I was getting about a 5 dB quieter signal. So that's actually pretty nice. And that can make the difference between having to do noise reduction in post-production versus potentially not having to do noise reduction. So that's a pretty nice feature. So it's about a $600 recorder. What else does it do? From the DR70D to the DR701D, there's a big price difference. It goes from this DR70D you could actually find a lot of times for, well, let's look. Let's see what the current pricing looks like. Let's go to the B&H. I'll go ahead and share this up on the screen here. Share that. Tascam DR70D. Yeah, about 250 US. So typically 250 US, and then the 701D comes in at 599. So it's pretty close. It's actually more than twice the price. So it's a very different recorder. The 70D has a plastic body, and while its preamplifiers sound quite good, it has plenty of gain. I believe it's about 64 dB of gain on the preamplifiers. The 701D, same specs there, and that's the interesting thing about Tascam is that they actually don't share a lot of specs that other manufacturers will. So, for example, they don't talk anything about dynamic range, which I thought was interesting. And the noise performance specs actually do look good, better on the 701D. And in fact, let's go and take a look at that. And keeping in mind, of course, that self-noise is only one of several different considerations when you're looking at preamplifiers. But let's see. I think it put it under handheld for whatever reason. Yeah, here's the 701D. Okay, first look at the 70D specifications. Input noise, minus 20 dBu. Let's pull this up in a separate tab here. 701D. This is just out of curiosity to see what they say. But they don't, again, they don't put anything, they don't specify anything in terms of dynamic range, which would be nice. But alas, they do what they do. That sounds an interesting comment. They say minus 124 dBu or less. That actually is pretty much in line with my test. I found about a 5 dB improvement in noise performance. So that's great. Signal to noise ratio, they say 100 dB or more on the 701. And they say 92 dB or more on the 70D. So they definitely redesigned, it seems, those microphone preamplifiers, and it seems to work pretty nicely. The build quality is much better on the 701D versus the 70D and the 60D. The body is actually magnesium alloy, so that's pretty tough. It's also very lightweight, which is a really nice choice on their part. So that's definitely part of what you're paying for. All the additional money is going to not only redesign preamplifiers, but also a much sturdier case that's going to stand up to day-to-day rigors of working on location. It's funny though, it's not, they're not all in. I felt like Zoom went a little bit more in on their F8 recorder, where the knob and the trim, the gain trim potentiometers were all metal. On the 70D or 701D, excuse me, these are all still plastic. So you do have the protection of the straps here, the metal straps, but these are still plastic. So you'll still potentially do some damage there if you drop those. So some other interesting things here. Let's look at, let me just show you some images here where you can see up a little bit closer. Yeah, over on this side here, and actually let's pull up a bigger version here. Yeah, so you can see here we have HDMI input and output as well as timecode input. That was pretty exciting. The nice thing about the HDMI ports is not only does it pass through the video, so in other words, if you wanted to feed the HDMI from your camera into this, and then from this into a monitor or a recorder, you could do that. What I haven't checked yet is to see, I don't think it's 4K compatible. When I tried to put a 4K signal through, it didn't pick it up. But Tascam can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I was able to send an HD signal through. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But the interesting thing about these the HDMI input at least, is that you can now, if your camera supports it, you can send control signals to the recorder, and you can also send time code to the recorder via HDMI, again, if your camera supports it. So amongst my two cameras, the Nikon D750 could send control signals. That's actually just a recent firmware update that they did, but it doesn't do time code. However, my Panasonic GH4 sends both control signals and sends time code. So what that means in practical terms is that when you're recording on your camera and recording the audio separately with your DR701D, these two are staying in sync in terms of time code. So it's going to be much easier to sync that up in post. It's just a matter of saying, hey, this one goes with this one, use time code, boom, and it's done. So that's kind of a nice feature as well. It does also have this more traditional kind of pro level BNC input for time code as well. However, well, I guess I should say I tested it. It works. I was able to jam sync the Tascam DR701D from my Zoom F8 recorder. However, if you jam sync it and then you disconnect the two, I found that the Tascam actually doesn't keep very good time. So if you're going to use this, you actually need to leave it connected to the timecode generator that you're using, whatever that is, which is a little bit of a bummer. Tascam did say that they include a temperature compensated crystal oscillator, which is a term for the fairly sophisticated clock that is supposed to keep time, and it's supposed to be highly accurate. In this particular case, here it is down here, it says temperature compensated crystal oscillator provides a solid internal clock. Like other Tascam professional studio equipment, the TXO or TCXO reduces clock errors to improve the quality of digital recording. Additionally, a phase-locked loop circuit with a discrete filter further reduces jitter for the best possible audio quality. That's interesting that they're kind of selling it as improving audio quality, and don't really talk about it from the standpoint of, and I guess that's part of it. It does contribute to the audio quality as well, but as far as time code is concerned, I found that it actually drifted a good solid 5 seconds per hour. So that's pretty extreme. Actually, it's not a very good performance I saw there. So that's something to keep in mind if you are looking for something that's pretty solid as far as time code is concerned. On the other hand, if you plug it in and use the HDMI time code, you leave that, in theory, you'd leave that plugged in the whole time you're shooting. And in fact, it looks like they're showing it with a Canon here, but if you leave that plugged in, they should stay synced together, and so that works very nicely. And in my tests, that held up very well. So that's all cool. One thing that I wasn't able to figure out, I don't know if it does it or not, but I was not able to find a way to solo any of the individual tracks on the DR701D, which is kind of a little bit of a letdown. That it seems like a type of feature that they'd want to put on a recorder in this realm. Also, one note along those lines, they really call it, here they're calling it the Ultimate Portable Audio System for Video Production. I thought I saw somewhere else where they were sort of marketing it as their kind of flagship for solo shooters. That is to say, people that have, just themselves or a very small crew, and they don't have a dedicated audio guy. So I would say that's actually a fair way to put it. This is probably best for those single shooters. Yeah, here it is right here. This is Tascam's flagship recorder for single shooter video production. And I would agree with that. I think they nailed that pretty well. What other things can I tell you about it? Let's get one of the other photos loaded up here. It does have these inbuilt microphones. I'm not usually a big fan of those. I don't usually use those. You can see them here on the back. But if you have a Slate or something like that, that can be, I guess, a fine thing there. There is a 3.5 millimeter input. That's not on this side. Let me get the other side. Here it is. 3.5 millimeter input right here. As with most 3.5 millimeter inputs, it's not quite as clean as the XLR inputs. So that's a consideration. It's not totally unusable. I would say that the same test, same studio location with a couple of sound blankets hanging up. I used a Rode lavalier, and I was able to get a noise floor once I loudness normalized to minus 24 LUFS in the minus 60 range. So that one would probably still require, and that's a noisy microphone, by the way. So, excuse me. So that wasn't the most awesome test. I probably would like to get my hands on a better lavalier microphone and do that test again. But this one, it doesn't appear to be quite as clean as the XLR inputs. Incidentally, you'll also notice here, these are Neutrik connectors. That's an upgrade. At least the DR60D Mark II did not have Neutrik connectors. And in fact, some people had complained of issues that their XLR connectors were getting stuck permanently in the recorder. And that's that's a little embarrassing. But the Neutrik connectors are pretty rock solid, pretty well respected in the industry. So I think that was a nice upgrade for them to make here. A little bit strangely, but I guess in light of the size of the overall unit, the headphone output jack is actually a 3.5 millimeter. It's not a 1/4 inch. Is that a huge deal? I don't know. I mean, I guess a 1/4 inch is typically going to be a little bit more robust, probably hold up a little better over time. But I think the thing also to consider is this little dial here to control the volume. Kind of a little bit cheesy. I guess it works. It does its job, but it didn't feel really solid to me. And in light of all of the other upgrades they made in terms of build quality, that seemed like a strange choice. But I guess maybe it was a choice of the amount of real estate that they really had on the recorder, which is not a lot, as you can see. All right. All right, so that's the DR701D. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear those. Let me know about that, and we'll cover that. But again, overall, I would say that the 701D is a pretty good nice upgrade. Let's stop sharing that actually really quickly. Bring my, there we go. Okay. So definitely a worthwhile recorder. I think it's for a certain type of shooter. So again, if you're a solo shooter, I think that could be a good choice. It does have the, the quarter 20 mount on top. So you put your camera on top of that, then you can mount the unit itself to the tripod if you're using a tripod. That actually works a lot better than it did on the 70D or the 60D. And the reason I say that is the 60D and the 70D both had that same setup, but the problem is that in those cases, the whole build was plastic, and I never felt very comfortable with that. The whole thing seemed to wobble around. And in fact, someone recently sent me a tweet over on Twitter and said, "Hey, don't expect the Tascam DR60D Mark II to be a pro quality device." And they showed a picture. I guess evidently their tripod tipped over, something happened, and the whole quarter 20 mounting tap on the bottom of the recorder got completely torn out. There's just a big gaping hole in the plastic case on the bottom. So I would say on the 60D, probably don't want to mount your camera on top of that if you can avoid it. And I've never made I actually would always have my camera in a cage and then attach the Tascam to the cage. But I think with the 701D, you could actually realistically use that in the way it was intended, with it underneath your camera and then it attached to your tripod. And it's very, very solid. So kind of a new world there. So that's good on Tascam's part. All right. If you do have any questions, go ahead and submit those over at the Google Plus page for those that are viewing. We'd love to hear your questions over there, and we'll talk about those. Let's talk about monitoring for a little bit. We did actually talk about this in the help session last week. I want to talk a little bit more about it today and just clarify a couple of things. First of all, you can see here today I am wearing my Beyerdynamic DT770 headphones. These are the ones I typically use when I am recording out in the field or even in studio. And the reason I use these are closed back, so there isn't going to be a lot of sound that's going to leak out of the headphones and potentially get into the actual audio recording. So that's a good thing. And that's typically what you're going to want to look for. Do I necessarily recommend these? I like these a lot. I've had these actually for probably 5 or 6 years now. They've really, really stood up well. It has a very long straight cable, and this is where this comes down to personal preference here. Some people prefer coiled cables, some prefer straight cables. This particular one has a straight cable. And it's just held up really, really well. The audio quality is good enough. Here's the thing, with closed back headphones, you always typically sacrifice some audio quality. They're not usually able to produce as an even a response over the entire frequency range of sound. So that's something you need to understand. But it also is good because you're not leaking sound out. They're also isolating enough that while I can still hear things outside of these, they're not noise canceling by any means. And you don't want noise canceling when you're doing monitoring typically. They're not noise canceling, but they do isolate your ears enough that you can hear what's happening in the recording itself. So these I think are a fine choice. There are plenty of other options out there as well that lots of others use. These are less convenient from the standpoint that they don't fold up. I mean, you get what you get. You got to haul that around. Not a big problem for me. I actually I have a little strap on my sound bag, which makes it very easy to carry around. But they do work very, very well. And the nice thing about these is they're very comfortable. This is probably the most comfortable set of headphones I've ever had to wear on a long-term basis. So if I've got to wear it for an hour or two, they're quite comfortable, and that matters. You got to be comfortable when you're out holding the boom pole or doing whatever it is you have to do for the production. Having comfortable headphones makes a difference. In terms of monitoring for post-production, that's a very, very different world. And there's a lot of debate about how you should monitor when you're doing post-production. The most important thing when you're doing post-production is to get as accurate a sound reproduction as you can. So you want whatever your playback headphones or monitors, speakers are to be as accurate as possible, because you want to be able to hear the problems with your audio and be able to fix those. And you want to also know have confirmation when you have fixed that problem. So the idea is to use something as accurate as possible. Headphones like this are probably not a good choice in that case, again, because they're closed back. They don't have the capability of producing sound that's quite as accurate across the frequency spectrum. So one thing also to keep in mind is that there's ongoing massive debates about whether you should do post-production monitoring with headphones at all. And some people have some very strong opinions about that. My personal opinion about that is that I think it's worthwhile to do both, to have both headphones and monitors, near field monitors. And what a near field monitor is, it's a speaker that's designed for accuracy, first of all, typically. At least that's what you hope your manufacturer has done. But it's also made for listening in a relatively near distance, so not very far away. It's not like a hi-fi speaker that's meant to fill an entire room. It's actually made to work in close proximity when you're at your edit desk. So we talked a little bit about that last week as well. And in my particular case, I'm using, and I'm not necessarily endorsing these. In fact, I think there's some issues with these. And I made this decision to buy these monitors years ago before I knew before I discovered some of the problems with them. But the KRK Rocket 8s, and let me just pull some of those up here real quick. We'll share this with you so you can see what I'm looking at here. Okay. These are very distinct looking. So you've probably seen these before, the yellow cones. Other manufacturers make them with yellow cones too, but KRK is kind of their signature. And typically for monitors for your listening environment, you're going to want something that has two drivers. Well, no, I take that back. Not necessarily, but if you want to be able to produce as much of the spectrum as you can, as accurately as possible, most people are using two driver systems. So they'll have a high frequency tweeter, very small speaker, usually made out of silk or some other material. And then you'll also have the woofer or the mid-range driver that will produce the lower frequency sounds. But one of the problems with this is, first of all, I'm working in my editing I do in a relatively small room. It's probably in the United States, we reckon by feet usually. So I'm going to say feet, and then we'll try and figure out what that means in terms of meters. But it's about 11 feet by 10 feet, I think, or maybe 9 feet by 11 feet. So it's kind of a rectangular, almost squarish room, very small. The ceilings are, I believe, 8 feet tall. So again, kind of a typical household room, relatively small household room. And the problem is when you put an 8-inch driver in a room like that, especially an 8-inch driver that has a ported design like this, which is supposed to extend the low frequency response, produce more bass, you actually end up overwhelming the room. And that's actually what's happening in my case, is that I've got these near field monitors in there that are really probably way too much for the room. So if you are looking for your first kit, I would probably look at something more like a 5-inch driver like this one here. But there's some other things I want to say about that as well before you, and I'm not necessarily making a recommendation here. They also, of course, have the 10-inch drivers that also come with a subwoofer. Definitely you want to stay away from these unless you're in a larger room. So definitely be careful. I was, I guess, caught in the American mindset of bigger is better. So when I first made this decision, and again, not knowing a whole lot about acoustics at that point. So some things to watch out for. Now, the reason I say that this is overwhelming the room is that in household rooms in particular, often in offices as well, but any kind of room that has not been acoustically treated, one of the biggest issues is that bass typically builds up. And the problem with that is that when bass frequencies build up, they actually start smearing the sound overall. And so it's more difficult to actually hear what's going on. And oftentimes what that results in is you just sort of get this low hum instead of being able to make out the difference between different bass frequencies. So it's best to not overwhelm your room. It's best not to go too crazy on the bass, like putting a subwoofer as well as two 8-inch drivers into a tiny little bedroom. maybe fine for listening to music and things like that, but probably not best if you're trying to accurately monitor what you're doing. So just some things to keep in mind there. One person's book that I read, who is a mixer over at Sound on Sound. Let's see. Actually, let me go to Amazon. And I'm going to pull up his book. I think his name is uh, Mixing Secrets. Mike Senior. Here it is. Mike Senior is the guy. It's a book I read quite some time ago. It's an awesome book. It's mostly focused on music is the problem, but there's lots to learn here in terms of acoustics. And he actually spends the very first part of the book, a significant amount of space actually, talking about what you should what considerations you'll want to take when you're trying to figure out where and with what monitors you're going to monitor your music and your mix. And one of the things he says is actually, if you can't spend at least $1,500 on a set of monitors, then you probably should avoid monitors that have a ported design. And again, a ported design is that they have some sort of port like this. It's a hole in the case. And the reason the manufacturers put that there is because, again, it gives you more bass response. But the problem is it's usually uncontrolled bass response. And the port actually will ring at certain frequencies. So you'll actually end up a lot of times with more one-note bass type of issues. That is to say, all the bass comes out at the same frequency. It feels really powerful and it feels kind of cool when you first hear it, but then you realize that you can't actually make out individual differences between two different bass frequencies. So he actually said, if you have a monitor like this already, stuff socks in it. Stuff socks in the port. And in fact, I've done that, and it actually seems to have helped my room. When I measured my room with a signal response and a measurement microphone, I actually found that there was the bass didn't linger as long, and actually things were a little clearer and easier to hear. So some things to consider there in your monitoring setup. Now, if you shouldn't get monitors with ports, what options are there out there? Well, let me show you one that I actually recently picked one of these up. I'm probably going to go get a second one, but it's the Baritone. C50A. This is it. So it's this cheesy little, it's actually not cheesy. It's $130. So it's not super cheap, but it's not like spending, $700 for a pair. They sell one at a time. You can obviously buy two, but just so you're aware, it's not $129.99 for the set of two. It's per each monitor. And this, you can see, just really has a relatively small, it's about a 5-inch, 5.25-inch speaker, they say. This has absolutely no ports on it. It does not have a hole in the case. And that will actually, the first time you listen to this, you'll be kind of underwhelmed, to be honest. You'll think, it doesn't sound that great. But the nice thing is with this kind of monitor is that you can actually hear a little bit more accurately. It's going to produce mostly the mid frequencies. It's not going to produce a lot of bass. It's not going to produce a lot of really high end. By high end, I mean high frequency sound as well. But it will focus on the most important parts of your dialogue or whatever it is you're mixing and help you make some better and more accurate mixing decisions. So this is something to consider. I'm going to get a second pair and we'll probably review them in the next little bit here. But as I put together my audio post-production course, that's one thing I'm looking at is, how do you get into monitoring without spending a fortune on doing it? So, and I didn't say this yet, but one other thing to consider as well, speakers and monitors have different design goals. So if you're talking about a hi-fi speaker, you could think, hey, couldn't I just use my hi-fi system? Well, yeah, you can do that. But typically hi-fi speakers are not made to be accurate. They're made to flatter the sound that they're producing. And typically what that means in practical terms is they're actually applying some sort of EQ to probably boost the bass a little bit and to boost the high frequency a little bit. That's pretty common in hi-fi speakers. Whereas monitors, at least in theory, and it varies from monitor to monitor, but monitors typically are designed to accurately reproduce the signal that they receive. And so that's a consideration there. So, all right, let's just double check in, see if we had any questions come in. It does not look like we have. Nope, not yet. Okay, so that's okay. I wanted to just go ahead and wrap it up there. We're gonna close it down now. I am still trying to get to some work on this post-production course. I've had a number of people talk about that. We'll continue to do the videos on the YouTube channel on post-production. In fact, we'll have one later this week, probably looking at Premiere Pro's new feature for loudness control, which looks pretty exciting. So look for that here in the next week or so. If you have any questions in the meantime, you're welcome to email me directly. For those in the course, you already have my email address. It's the one I send out all the alerts on. But for those of you that don't, you can reach me at curtis@learnlightandsound.com. And happy to hear any questions you have there that we can cover on our next episode next week. Thanks for joining today, and we'll talk to you again next week.